You're just days away from the election, and there's a lot of information out there. Here are 3 things you need to know from the Bipartisan Policy Center. 1. There will be a surge in voting by mail, which is safe and secure. And 2. You likely won't know who won on election night, since it will take longer to count all the ballots and report the results. And finally, your usual polling site might be different to keep you and poll workers safe. Check out canivote.org if you're not sure where to go. By planning ahead and knowing what to expect, you can make sure your voice is heard at the ballot box.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, What Childcare in 25 States, What We Know and What We Don't Know. My name is Linda Smith, and I'm the Director of the Early Childhood Initiative at the Bipartisan Policy Center here in Washington, D.C. With me today will be Anna Bob Bagley, who is the CEO and founder of Arth Analytics, and Ben Walters, who is on the staff at BPC, who helped pull this report together. Before we get started today, there are several people that I really want to give thanks to for their support of this project. First, a shout out to Jesse Rasmussen at the Buffett Early Learning Fund, who supported this work from the beginning. Also to the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, the Heising Simons Foundation, and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation for their support of our general work. I think there's a special thanks that we'll go to as we get into the briefing. You will see that there was a state advisory committee. There are 12 states that worked with us on that advisory committee, and I really appreciate all the work that they did with us, along with the other 13 states who shared their data and their time and expertise with us on this project. So today we're going to report on what we have looked at in the childcare need and demand, or I should say potential demand for care in 25 states. The report is posted on our website along with an interactive website that you can go to, and we're going to demonstrate this and you'll see how that works, but so that you can actually look at and understand the data. The slides from this briefing will also be posted on our website, as well as the paper describing the methodology that we used. So let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Here we go. Okay, so what we wanted to start out and talk about a little bit here today is, childcare and really what we need in this country. How do we quantify what we have, what we need, and the gap across the country? So let's go to the next slide, please. So how much do we really need? And we know that there is broad support for childcare at all levels of government, but very little is known about the amount of care the country actually needs to meet the need, and where that exists. So BPC asked this question: how much do we need to meet the need for childcare for this country? So go on to the next slide. So one of the things we wanted to do was look at the quantity of childcare in all 50 states. To be honest, we started out to map 50 states. That said, as we all know, something happened in between, and we did get to where the country hit the wall with the pandemic. And so we had to think carefully about where we were going. I want to back up and tell you a little bit in terms of the 50 state project that we originally set out to do and why. When we started the work, we were thinking about the 50 states along the lines of what we did when I was with the military system at the Department of Defense. And as many of you know, the Congress passed the Military Child Care Act of 1989 and asked the Department of Defense to basically quantify the need for child care for military families and send them a plan on how we intended to meet that need. Since then, no such request has ever been made of the states or the country. So we really don't have a comprehensive plan for how we expect to meet the need, let alone to know how much we really still need. So on to the next slide, please. So what we did was set out to determine what is the actual supply of childcare in all 50 states, the potential need, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more as we go on, and then to quantify the gap. So our goal was, as I said, to give policymakers a baseline from which to establish goals for the country and hold policymakers at all levels of our government accountable. Next slide, please. This slide actually looks at what we did in terms of the methodological decisions that we had to make and how to interpret the results and the findings from the study. So what we did, and you'll see on the left-hand side of this screen, the State Advisory Committee, the 12 states that I mentioned earlier in terms of who came and who helped us with this project. So what we actually started out doing was to look at several states as examples, and then move on to 12 more states and bring them in and talk to people about our methodology and what we did. So we started actually with asking them to help us with certain things like developing definitions, identifying data sources, reviewing the analytics, and then helping us present the results to the public. So again, a great shout out to the 12 people who came in, or the 12 states, I should say, who came in to help us with this work. On to the next slide, please. So what we ended up doing, as I said, we intended to do all 50 states, but the pandemic happened, and guess what? Things seemed a little different. And so we thought carefully, and we put a pause button on the study of the states, and we decided to finish up with the 25 states that we had in some process. That said, we think the 25 states that we have, and they're shown on this map, are still politically and geographically diverse. So while we don't claim that they are necessarily representative, we think they represent a fair amount of what's going on in the country. To the next slide, please. So what we are doing here was to start to look at the number of childcare slots offered by, as we defined it, legally operating and state-recognized providers. And I will add that this definition was one that was agreed to by the 12 State Advisory Committee as we tried to work through how we were going to move on to do all 50 states. So the definition became really important. And so when we went to the next states, asking them to give us exactly that, anything that they saw as legally operating in their states. So that we started there, then we went from there. We talked to the Department of Defense, and they shared their data with us, and thanks to them, and to the National Head Start Office, who shared their data with us. And that was important because in some states we found that while the states had the location of the actual Head Start programs, in many cases they did not have the data for the delegate agencies. So we basically started from there. I will tell you that if there's a hole in the data at this point, and one that we're certainly looking at, it's the tribal data. And depending on whether or not the tribal data is in the state databases, depends on whether it's in the state's data. So we're taking a look at how do we basically begin to get our arms around the tribal data moving forward. It should be noted here that it was important to us that the data was only incorporated and used in our analysis when it was after the state had agreed to and approved the data that we used. So we didn't want to move forward unless there was full recognition and concurrence with the states in terms of the data that we had. So on to the next slide, please. So this slide shows the number of legally operating programs in the 25 states that we've mapped. That there are 154,993 childcare providers in these states. The total number of spaces that represents is 5,901,319 spaces. And we're going to take a look at this in just a second as we begin to look at the gap. So let's go to the next slide. So after we mapped the number of spaces, we started to look at the potential need. And it's important to stress that this is the potential need. And that was defined as the number of children under 6 with all available parents in the labor force. And it's, again, important that people know that this is not necessarily the demand, because the demand will depend on a number of factors that really are unknown. We did start out to look at some of those factors, and I'm going to get into that in just a second when we talk about the parents and the parents' choices. But that said, it was important that we looked at this by the potential need, not the actual demand. So what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Anubhav, who's going to walk us through how we actually measured this gap. And Anubhav, do you want to explain this? Because I would be way out of my element if I tried to do it.
Thank you, Linda.
Next slide.
Next slide, please. So really, as Linda was mentioning, we had data on the potential need, which was coming from census block group data. Then we had the data on the childcare facilities and their locations and the capacity that we got from all our state partners, Head Start, Department of Defense. Now, looking at between those two, really, we're tasked to calculate what is the total number of potential childcare gap. So what we did was we've obviously mapped all of these, and then every block group and every family in that block group gets to now access in this model childcare spaces and facilities within 3.5 miles drive distance for urban areas and 10 miles drive distance in rural areas. So that means you've got different competing block groups and different families and different block groups that are now getting assigned to these childcare spaces, and that gets to be run across the 25 states. That means that this analysis is run across state boundaries. There are certain metro areas that cross state boundaries, et cetera, and there are multiple states in there. So we're able to run that analysis using that distance. There were a couple of states that provided us data on childcare, their family locations for the children that were getting subsidies, and data on what childcare facilities they were going to. And that was great data for mile and 10 mile distance. So once you've run this allocation routine where we've assigned and matched childcare facilities to the children in that age group, et cetera, you get that gap. That gets us that gap by a block group to get us what is the childcare gap. Obviously, that is across those areas, and then we are able to then aggregate that to any geography that we run this analysis for. Now, Linda, back to you.
Okay, I want to back up to the previous slide because one of the things that I skipped over there was actually what we show to be the actual need. This is broken down by county, but as you will see when we get into the demonstration of the live website, it can be broken down in a number of ways. But the need across the country in 25 states is that number that you see up there, the 8,448,993. That is the actual projected need based on the parents' participation in the labor force in 25 states in this country. And in a second, you're going to see what that gap actually looks like. So let's skip ahead now to this. There you go. So I've stressed, and I want to stress it again, that potential need does not equal actual demand. And one of the things that when we started this work, we started looking at parent choice. We didn't even know when we actually started the work whether parents preferred it closer to home, closer to work. We went back and looked at the data. We have figured that out in a couple of surveys actually showing that parents are more likely to want childcare closer to home. What this also doesn't factor in is some of the other preferences they may have for, their own relatives caring for or their family members caring for children. So we've done now what I would say 3 national surveys to keep digging into what is it that is driving parent choice in this country. And I can't overstate the need for states and communities to understand their parents and their need. The other things that are a factor in a community's need for care are going to be the need for non-traditional hours care, the preferences, as I said, and certain other types of care that may be available. So let's go on to the next slide then. There are other cultural factors in looking at the need or the potential demand in a community, and they can go reflect things from things like cultural influences, parents in the workforce, poverty level is a big one. So we've looked at this by a number of different factors, and to look at and estimate the need in some of these communities. And you're going to see this again when we go into the live demonstration. So let's go on to the next slide. So here is what we came up with. It is basically the potential need minus the supply that we have. And there you see the child care gap in 25 states, over 2,600,000 children potentially need care. And that's why this potentially needed care and the parent choice is such an issue in determining the ultimate gap for care. So the percentage is a whopping 31.7% is the gap. And that is huge. And as we continue to work on this, we're going to have to take a serious look at how we're going to close that gap. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So some of the other factors that we found, essentially rural versus urban, where there was definitely a bigger gap percentage-wise between the rural and the urban communities. And we wanted to look more into that, and we have begun to dig into that in some of the parent survey work that we've been doing. And it is still relatively unclear to what extent family and friend care can or will reduce the supply in rural areas. There is a big question mark on some of that, and we've looked at that in our survey work, and we'll be digging into that again. So go on to the next slide. Another thing that we wanted to look at was, as many of you know, the opportunity zones were created in the last tax package. And there's a big incentive for investors to invest in some of our poorer neighborhoods. We've been trying to sort this out at BPC in terms of the ability to get childcare into some of these opportunity zones. And so this was our look at what is the gap in the opportunity zones. Obviously, the red is the higher gap, and then the blue is where there's not as much. So you'll look at that. In some places higher, some places lower, but still worth paying attention to as we begin to develop businesses and other industries in these zones. On to the next slide, please. So some of the other issues that we looked at when we started to look at the data and pull it apart were socioeconomic characteristics. And I think we looked at a number of things, as you can see on this slide: the high percentage of minority residents, median household income, which is up there. And for those of you on the call who understand the 85% of state median income issue, that's the line at which child care subsidies, families will qualify for child care subsidies. So we wanted to look at that in particular, and then the federal poverty line. So although there were different trends in every state, you will be able to look at this more closely in your particular state when we look at the map. So let's keep going on to the next slide, please. So before we move on, I want to just recommend that people submit questions to, as we described in the introduction, to the chat or to the various options that you showed there, because we really do want to have a conversation with people around the country who are looking at this to help us understand how to move forward and do better. So now I'm going to turn it over to Anubhav, and he's going to walk you through the map itself and show you what we have in there before we get to our panel.
Thank you, Linda. So I'm going to walk everybody through a live demo of the website. So wish good luck to me on a live demo. So the website childcaregap.org is also connected to the place where we have the report. When you start the map itself, you get to see a map of the whole 25 states where we have conducted the analysis to date. The gray states are ones that we haven't done that analysis yet. The idea is to do these 25 and do another one after the current COVID pandemic. So dark colors here are showing you the childcare gap that Linda mentioned. And you could change the colors, change the maps, and start looking at the percent gap, start looking at supply, that is the number of childcare facilities and the slots, and the potential need. As you hover over the map itself, and that potential need is the data on children 5 and under coming from the Census Bureau. As you hover over the map, you can start seeing what is the total numbers by the congressional districts that we have selected. Back again, I'll go to the childcare gap, and you can see that. You could change geographies, and instead of looking at congressional districts, if you know exactly at this scale and seeing what county you are interested in, then you can look at that. Same deal with Senate, state Senate. We can zoom into a map and start looking at details on a particular area, zoom in, zoom out, move the map around, just like you would do in any map. Metropolitan statistical areas are where not only have we done and showing the gap itself, but kind of a heat map of those gaps. So here you're seeing area by the Chicago, Illinois area, and you're looking at Indianapolis, where the gap is at about 37%. Chicago area, the gap's about 43%. The darker areas are where that gap is much higher. The lighter areas, the gap is lower. You could just zoom around and move this and see there are certain metro areas that are not complete just because of the fact that we don't have data for all the states at this time. So you can look at all of those. As you see these, you can also start seeing the gap for opportunity zones and the supply and potential need, and identify the opportunity zones doing that. Beyond the map itself, you have data here for all the 25 states in terms of their supply. You can get the total number of childcare spots, get to see the data on a table if you'd like. Same data on the potential need, which, reminding you, is children 5 and under. The data coming from U.S. Census Bureau, American Community Survey, that data about childcare. And then the gap itself, that gap, looking at this, you see that the gap in terms of sheer numbers is the highest for the state of California. And then obviously certain other larger states. Arizona, where I'm from, is 76,000. You can toggle this and see what is the gap, but a percent gap too. Final piece on this piece of the page is that information that Linda was just talking about, was that disaggregating that gap by different socioeconomic characteristics. So this chart really is trying to show you, is the gap in this case higher or lower in higher minority areas? So block groups that have minority population of 25% or more are selected, and you're looking at their gaps. The darker colors, the darker reds, are where the gap is higher than the statewide average, and the greens are where the gap is lower than the statewide average. So in this case, Wisconsin, Wyoming, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Iowa, the gap is lower than the statewide average in for minority areas where minority population live. The same piece of analysis is available by population and households under 85% of median income or above 85% of median income. So that's covering you populations on the lower end of the income scale and the higher end, and then poverty and 200% of poverty. So that gets this national picture, looking at that across the board. Since we got Todd talking later, let's select Maine and look at Maine, the data for Maine. Here you're looking at data for Maine on the map by their opportunity zones. That's the congressional district or their state Senate districts. And you can select each one of them and look at that. You also have data. Maine currently has a childcare gap of 9.2%, which is about 4,920. So the data here is for, again, the supply side of things, the potential need. And the other piece that Linda was talking about was this chart that's extremely interesting, that came out of conversations with our advisory group, was this idea of, can we look at populations and children where parents are in the labor force and not in the labor force, and does that help us answer some questions? So in Maine's case, the top chart is showing us that 7.5% of children with parents in labor force are in poverty, which is lower than the 25 state average of about 8.7%. But there's 60.1% as against the 53% children with all parents that are in labor force and not in poverty. What's interesting here is the red, the colors in the darker red colors and the pink colors are that population that is not in labor force. This is connect this and show you the same thing for Idaho, which is quite different. Where in Idaho, just by family choice, there is a larger population of children where the parents are not in labor force, as against what we saw in Maine. Finally, the charts that you have are here, all the same here. Linda, is there anything else you'd like me to cover at this stage on the website?
Understand is the gap, or sometimes the overlap between states, and where we could and could not look at that based on state borders. If you could maybe just describe that a little bit.
So there are certain, so we did look at, since we're running this model across all 25 states, since the data is not available in certain states, that we did not collect the data at this time. There are metro areas, etc., or there are gaps. For example, Washington, D.C. is amalgamation of a number of states. Currently, our analysis is only for West Virginia and for Maryland. There are other states that are not included at this time. But if we want to include those, then that's possible, absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you, Anubhav. I think what we're going to do next is move on to our panel. On our panel, if we can bring them up, we have three state representatives who have participated in this work with us. First is Todd Landry. He's the director of the Maine Office of Child and Family Services. Next is Beth Oppenheimer, who's the executive director of the Idaho AEYC and also the Preschool Development Grant POC for the state of Idaho. And Tracy Gruber, who is the director of Utah's Office of Child Care. I wanted to start out, two of you were on our 12th state advisory committee that we worked with when we started this work last December. And I wanted to ask you guys what you have learned from this project and how you've used the data. So I'm going to start with you, Todd. If you could sort of tell us how you've used this data in Maine and what have you learned from it?
Well, for us, this project was extremely important because we knew that we had some data that showed what the potential gap was for childcare in Maine, but we knew it didn't have the level of granularity and detail to really be able to help us make policy decisions with that data. And so what this project was able to do for us is using the distance data, and we were one of the states that was able to provide actual information regarding where our families were who are on child care subsidies. So we're able to get down to an even greater granular level. We're able to see that there was, while we still have a gap in Maine, the gap was much more pronounced in our rural areas versus in our urban areas. And while we had known that we had had some of that discussion from an anecdotal perspective, we were able to quantify exactly what that was and begin to make some policy decisions related to that. The other thing that this was very helpful for us to do was, from an education perspective with our legislators, advocates, and others, because we were able to drill down to congressional district, to House districts, to state Senate districts, we were able to very clearly show that instead of this being a theoretical discussion, we were able to show it down to that district level, particularly for our legislators in the state house, to be able to see exactly what it was in their neighborhoods. And when you do that, you begin to take this from a theoretical exercise to one that is much more detailed, much more granular, much more personal. And so the information becomes much more relatable and much easier for us to make some policy decisions on, as well as to educate others about where our gaps are. So the combination of those two pieces really enabled us to drive some policy decisions, particularly in this case as it relates to rural areas that we want to make improvements in. And I would say I think that's become even more important in the past 7 months during COVID.
I think, yeah, we really appreciated the work that Maine had done, and it was the one of the states that had distance data that helped us inform that work. I think that was extremely helpful. I think the other thing that we learned, and if I can piggyback on what you said, Todd, is that by digging down into the data by districts, it also makes it a little bit more bite-sized. That it's easier to understand some of this if these huge numbers are somewhat daunting, and where do you begin? So I just put that out there, but we thank Maine for the work that they did on the distance piece particular.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. When you take it at a total state level, even in a relatively less populous state like Maine, it's still really large numbers. It's hard to really try to wrap your hands around that. But when you get it down to, the House districts or state House districts level, you get down to very specific numbers, and it's really then about your neighbors. It's about your constituents, and it really makes a big difference when you're driving policy changes and policy decisions related to what is happening in your neighborhoods, in your towns, in your cities.
Okay, let's go to Tracy. How about you, Tracy? You were on the advisory committee. You helped us work through the definitions and so forth. Sort of, have you used the data, and what has it meant to you?
Well, thanks, Linda, and thanks first for the support in the Bipartisan Policy Center's involvement in this issue. For Utah, the timing of this project could not have been better. I mean, there had been some recent reports, national reports, that had identified Utah's child care gap, and some legislative action at the local level that was trying to get its arms around what Utah's child care need was. And there was a little bit of dissonance in our office. Like, we weren't feeling like what we were hearing at that level was actually what we were seeing on the ground. So when the data became available that Anubhav presented, and tried to quantify the need in Utah, we really seized that opportunity to take that data and couple it with a qualitative survey that we had done a year or two prior, to try and figure out what families wanted in terms of childcare. So we were able to take the data, the quantitative side of the data, combine it with the qualitative data that we had, and we actually released our own report right before we were all sent home. It was actually the day before we were all sent home because of COVID-19, to quantify, based on parent preferences, family choice, how many childcare providers we're estimating we need in the regulated realm, with acknowledging that here in Utah, there are some, as in any state, some unique dynamics going on where family choice is demonstrating that they'd rather rely on families and neighbors in a more kind of informal regulatory setting for their kids' care. So that's really how we have used the data so far. And in that report that we released, we also included some policy recommendations. So we were able to leverage the report to try to bring attention to other arenas, non-traditional partners, I would say, in the early childhood sphere, like businesses who want to attract employees and acknowledge their involvement in helping us strategize in meeting that access, and also economic development, which we are having a lot of here in Utah.
Mm-hmm. You put your finger on something that I think is really important, and that I should have said in the parent issue, is I think that we can do a lot of work at the national level in trying to understand parent choice. But at the end of the day, this is the local issue, and we need to engage parents in a more meaningful way in sort of what it is they want and will actually use, because I think we've for too long made a lot of assumptions about what child care they want. And I think, again, we need to force this issue down to the community level and to understand it within the context of all of the factors that are in your communities and your states. Beth, you came into this towards the end, and we're not on the 12th state, but what have you learned from all of this, and sort of how have you used this data?
Thank you, Linda. I think what we learned in Idaho is the complexity of our data systems within the state. While we have a statewide data system tracking childcare, it really only tracks state level data and then also our subsidy programs. But we have 8 cities within Idaho that also track their own childcare data. And so we're finding a lot of gaps and whatnot, and these data systems don't talk with one another. We're working very hard with the cities throughout Idaho to connect their city level data with our statewide data, and our child care administrator is doing a great job with building that relationship to be able to do that. So we learned that we do have a lot of gaps. We know a lot of information about some areas, but not others. The other piece that I think that it gave us is that we have recently formed very good relationships with our business industry, and that's through the Idaho Association of Commerce and Industry. And this data is going to allow us to really drill down into those areas within Idaho that we know have bigger gaps more so than the other. But as Linda was saying, it's also our family values and cultures within Idaho are very different. Eastern Idaho has a very different family value system than, let's say, North Idaho does. And so by partnering with our business industries and really drilling down to find out what their working families within their companies want and need, I think that that's going to allow us to better come up with solutions, whether that's family child care centers, whatever that looks like across the board. And so this is a good starting point. The other piece that this is that we've learned from this is how we can use this in our PDG. We are just finishing up our first round of PDG right now, and this information has gone into our needs assessment, which should be done here fairly shortly, and we'll be able to take a deeper dive and look at that and see what we need to do in the future.
You know, I think you say an important thing, and as we begin to involve business in this conversation more and more frequently, you know, business people are used to having defined need and goals. And I think that's the one thing that a takeaway from the military model is that once we had a goal, albeit very big, even in those days in the military, we knew where we were going and we could quantify it. And I think holding people accountable to those goals became, you know, something that everyone bought into. And I do think business is a big player in all of this. To each of you, what advice would you give to other states on some of this? What have you learned from this that maybe they could benefit from what you've learned along the way? Let's start, Tracy, with you.
Well, I think the need for having common definitions at the outset and understanding what your regulatory landscape is in trying to get the data, and recognizing that need does not equal demand. And I think that the only way to kind of figure out what the true need is in a state is by making sure that you have that parent preference piece in. And I know for our state, it's time for us to reevaluate that, especially in the wake of the pandemic. Our parent preference data is now a little bit outdated, as probably everyone's states are. And if you're really trying to figure out how much to invest, you have to have both pieces in order to have the thorough analysis. And just also, who is your audience when you're thinking about this data? I think for most of us in the early childhood landscape, this information is not new to us. We have known that there's a need for more early care and education programs in our states and nationwide, but being able to leverage this information for our non-traditional partners, like, as you mentioned, Linda, business and economic development entities and long-range planners to incorporate this issue as we're trying to rebuild our economy, I think is just critically important. It was before the pandemic and even more so now.
Okay. Beth, how about you?
That states look at bringing everyone to the table. Oftentimes, these activities are sort of done in a vacuum at state level, you know, state systems, but we really need to bring in our business partners. We need to bring in our families. We need to bring in our advocates to the table. and work as closely with we can as everyone, because we can't just have one set of data and say, okay, we've got this figured out, now we can move forward. We really have to look at it through the lens of so many different audiences, and bringing everyone to that table to be able to look at where are we and where do we need to go is really going to make a big difference.
Okay. And Todd, how about you? You're on mute, Todd.
Key pieces for us, in addition to what my colleagues have indicated, is data. One of the things that we found in Maine as a positive was some of the data that we had access to really got us to a granular level where we can make some really quality, I think, decisions around policy. But it also identified where we still have some needs in our data area. So, for example, we don't have the breakdown on age range. And so one of the key questions for us going next as a next step to this analysis, and it's included in the BPC report as a recommendation, is to get down to the age level. I think North Carolina and maybe one other state has that kind of level of data in their systems. We don't in Maine. And so we're making some guesses as it relates to the age breakdown, infant, toddler, preschool, and school age. We need to go that next step, because if we're going to continue to make good policy decisions, we want to do that from a data-driven perspective. And if you don't have the underlying data components in your systems to be able to conduct the analysis on, it's going to still be a little bit of a guessing game, which is what none of us want to do with these resources.
Right. And you mentioned North Carolina. The other state I think that had that level of data was Indiana, and it was very helpful to start to parse that out, because I think, again, this is where parent choice and young infants comes into play, probably more so than 3 and 4 year olds, where what do you do with your littlest babies? And that's, I think parents have a lot of thoughts about that we aren't factoring into this discussion. So I want to just go to the last slide that we have on here before we turn to questions from the audience. So one of the things that we're doing in our report, if we could pull up the last slide with the recommendations on it, please. Next slide. There you go. Okay, so as Todd talked about, we found a real problem with the lack of data on the capacity of these programs by age. And there are a lot of assumptions, and I think a lot of them are pretty well founded, that we lack infant and toddler care in this country. And I think we all believe that, but we can't quantify that. And I think that's one of the things that we need to get a better understanding of, both what do we have capacity by age, and then what do parents want capacity, by age of child. Those two things have to match up ultimately, and I don't think we have enough information yet on that. The issue in terms of capacity, what is the difference between licensed capacity, desired capacity, and enrolled capacity? As many in the audience will know, some programs will say they'll be licensed for 100, but they really ideally want to take 80. So if their goal is to take 80, how many then are they taking? What is the enrollment against their desired capacity versus their licensed capacity? I think there's some things that we need to sort out, and we have come on strongly in recommending point in time counts of some of these things to figure out what's going on with this particular issue. We've talked here earlier in terms of multiple databases, and we do need to begin to align these data sets and to figure out how we can get them. In some states, we had to go to many offices, and I, on above, could probably tell horror stories on that, of going to multiple offices and then getting the data mapped, only to find out there was yet another data source that we didn't have and hadn't had access to. So I think getting our heads around these data sources and getting them consolidated is a challenge. And then finally, one that's near and dear to me is obviously the lack of data. Of all of the data sources we could not get consistent access to, it was tribal childcare. And that has so much to do with relationships between tribes and state governments, et cetera. But at this point, we don't have a handle on what that looks like and what the need is in Indian country. So I think what was described, we plan to now pause and in the next year go into begin to reassess the 25 states that we've done to figure out what has happened to the supply and the potential need based on COVID. So we will redo this survey sometime in the next year, or not survey, this analysis, to take a look at what's happening out there with the child care supply and potential need. So with that, I want to bring Ben to the screen and see, Ben, if we have any questions for either the panel or for any of the other presentations from the audience. So Ben, what do you have?
Yes, hi everyone. So now we have an opportunity to listen to some questions from the audience and get some answers from Linda and Anubhav, but also the state panelists. The first question I'll go to here is from Ariane Hegowich. Does the gap analysis differentiate between full-time and part-time care? And this might be a question more to you and Anubhav, Linda.
Well, I'm going to ask Anubhav to talk about that first and then have the state people weigh in on this one, because this one, we talk about this in the report, and it was a challenge to understand whether or not part-day preschool programs, what they are filling in terms of the parent need for childcare. And I think that we make recommendations in the report on this, and it is still one of the issues that we have yet to resolve. So Anubhav, how do you want to address that? And then I'm going to go to the panel.
Sure. Thanks, Linda. So as you mentioned, yes, this was one of those data pieces that we didn't get a clear pieces of, is that childcare full-time or not? And the number of different ways we could classify the time of care was varied all across the 25 states. In general, if possible, we kept with the full-time care, but that data was, as I said, was not complete there. So, but then some states asked us to keep the part-time care in there too. So back to that the analysis was highly driven by the state representatives and people that we were working with. So it just depended on what states, but in general, it was more full-time than part-time.
Mm-hmm. In your states, I think, Todd, we talked about the pre-K issue in Maine, I know. How did you resolve that?
Yeah, we partially resolved it from that perspective of partial day care, but we still had a bit of a gap. So we were able to partially resolve it with the data that we had, but we still have a little bit of a question mark on that. And so that'll be part of what we need to address going forward. And I think it becomes particularly important during a time period like we're in right now with the COVID pandemic, because we know that the need for school-age care, particularly with districts with a hybrid learning format, it becomes even more critical. So I think we had a partial answer to it, but for the most part, like Anubhav said, it was primarily still driven by the full-time care paradigm.
Mm-hmm. Tracy or Beth, how did you deal with that? Tracy?
Yeah, I think that this is an ongoing challenge for us. I mean, we talked about the licensing capacity issue and needing to know licensing capacity by ages. And there's also a real need, I think, for Utah definitely to know enrollment numbers. And enrollment numbers change all the time. And they also change part-time, full-time enrollment. Sometimes you have a parent who only needs care 2 days a week. Maybe there's a parent who only needs part-time care. And every program is defining that part-time, full-time issue a little bit differently. So I think that this is another area where having common definitions nationwide would really help. I don't know how you do that. It's very complicated. And I think also when we, at least in Utah, we're dealing with the pandemic and how to support programs with the lost enrollment or the reductions in enrollment and having their operating costs have stayed the same, but their enrollment going down, how do you get a handle on what really happened with their enrollment? And I think it brings in this part-time, full-time quandary that we are needing to kind of answer, not only for this project, but just on issues as they arise.
Mm-hmm. And Beth, how about you in Idaho?
I think that the question around age and getting data around age is really important for Idaho. That Idaho is one of a handful of states that does not have public preschool. And so really being able to break that down and looking at what that need is for, not only as we look towards the future for preschool age care and education, but also for the infant toddler, as we're building public-private partnerships throughout Idaho to tackle the need of preschool age children. I think that information such as this is going to be really critical to that conversation.
Okay. So Ben, other questions?
Fantastic. We have a similar data collection question that I think would be important to talk about from Gina Adams. Gina says, what about state variation in which home-based providers are license exempt? And I know on the team, we discussed a lot about how to deal with different licensing definitions while collecting the supply data. She says, do states that license family child care serving just one child have more of their supply counted than those with higher thresholds for licensing their family child care providers?
I'm going to ask Bob to think about that one. Well, the first response to that is that if it was legally operating within the state, that was how we got to that original definition. And in any state database, we put that into our analysis. So I think that was the basic decision that we had to make, is what was in and what was out. But if it was legal in the state and it's in a database. So Bob, was there anything else we may have missed on that question?
The only thing I would add to that, Linda, was that in a couple of states, the most recent one, Texas, comes to mind, where their staff and teams recommended not to include the family child care, because that was only taking care of their own personal children. Up to 3 children is their rule there. So we did not include that for Texas.
Mm-hmm. And I will stress to the audience is that some of these decisions, as I said, these we considered this data state data. States own it. We wanted it to work for them, but we did need to understand some have some national comparisons. So to the extent that these were decisions, some of them just were left to the states. So Ben, other questions?
Yes, and another important question, and you touched on this a little bit, Linda, going forward, and how states can use this to understand the situation around COVID. Grace Reef asked, what's the plan for the next 25 states and maybe redoing the current states post-COVID? And I also might add, how might states who are interested in getting their data in our analysis reach out to us?
Ooh, that's a 3-pronged question there. Well, the next step in terms of these states will be to redo the analysis sometime, probably late spring of next year, when we think we are through this period and what we may think is the settling, the dust settles on some of this. So that said, the other 25 states, at this point, we don't have a plan to go beyond the 25 that we have. So that was our agreement with our funder, that we would pivot and do 25 now and 25 in another year. So that's kind of where we left it. I think if states are interested in anything, they could probably contact us and we could see what we could do if their data, depending on the availability of data. It's certainly something that we would love to still be able to do the 50-state comparison at some point in time. So I think that answers the question.
Perfect.
Ben, are there other questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great. And one more question I'm interested in asking the panelists myself. How do the panelists work to understand parent choice in their states currently? I know this is a piece that we wrote about a lot in the report, and it's important to understanding and interpreting this data correctly, because as we said, this is potential need data, not actual demand. And it's very difficult to get actual demand data because that data varies seasonally, day by day, really. And it's difficult to get that by geography. So is there anything states can do or that your states are doing right now to kind of look at this issue.
Mm-hmm. Let's start with you,
Okay.
Beth. You nodded there.
That parent choice is a big issue here in Idaho, and while we are a fairly large state, the different areas have different family values. The good news is that we don't have very many people in Idaho. We only have about 1.7 million people in Idaho. So getting information like this might be a little bit easier for us per district, per region. So we are doing a follow-up. We did a survey in July looking at what the impact that childcare has had on families, and this is directed at families, but we're able to reach a good portion of our families and get that information. And through PDG and some other resources, we're going to continue to survey parents, and again, in partnership with our business community, they're able to reach out to working families within their business to find out what their specific needs are and what their wants are in terms of childcare. I think so often, and for a long time, businesses said, childcare, that's a family issue. We're not going to get involved in that. Thankfully, that conversation is shifting a little bit, and they are starting to get more involved in that. And so they're able to assess their own working families within their community, which will give us really good information, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Todd, how about Maine?
What I can share is that I think we've done an okay job of getting some information from parents about what their preferences are through our surveys and our partners that have worked with us on this. I think the last 7 months have shown us just how quickly a status can change, though. I think what we're going to see coming out of COVID is potentially a much greater interest by parents in smaller home-based settings or family-based settings, particularly that impacts us here in Maine and rural areas. But I think in the past, we've seen a preference for center-based care in our urban areas. And I think there's a chance that's going to change now, and we may see more of a desire for more family-based care even in our more urban areas. So I think the trick on this is twofold. One, yes, we have to include the family voice and making sure we're taking into account what their preferences are for the care of their children. But second, we've got to recognize that it can change very, very quickly. And if anything has taught us these past 6 months, I think we also have to become very, very flexible with how we react to some of those challenges.
Tracy, how about Utah?
Yeah, so in Utah, our best approach in getting parent preferences incorporated was by doing the parent survey. I think the hard thing about surveys at this point is that people are overloaded on surveys. And then I think you gotta kind of switch your approach. So maybe more focus group type engagement. So again, I think Todd is absolutely right. Parent preferences a year ago look very, very different than they do today. And we need to figure out how to incorporate that. And then also, I think we're going to have to do it again, because I don't know if these temporary preferences during the pandemic are the preferences that are going to stick with us. And then you have to change your approach to building the system. But that's how we've approached it, is by doing surveys, figuring out amongst parents with kids under the age of 6, did they have a child care need? What did the need look like? How did they fill the need? And look at it geographically. So we differentiated by all of our counties to get the data.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you say that about the focus groups. Before we started this work, we actually were doing a series of focus groups with parents around the country, and we've done several of them, and actually got a lot of feedback, very interesting feedback on some of this. So I think that led to our survey work, which I want to remind our audience that we have now done 3 surveys starting in last October, then April, and then just finished one in August. And I would point people to those surveys because I think we're gradually, I have to say, we're getting a little bit better at asking the questions and knowing how to, what the questions are, to be honest with you. So I think there's a lot more to be done on parents and parent choice, but it's a big issue. And Tracy, to your point, I think it's going to be a big variable for the next couple of years until we get through and everything gets stabilized. So I think we're about ready to run out of time. I want to close this out by thanking the three people on this panel again, Todd, Beth, and Tracy, for their time and energy, not just for this, but for all the work that we've done over the last several months on the mapping project across the board, and for their wisdom, I would say, in so many ways. If you want to learn more about some of this work, be sure to check out the report. In there is a case study on the Maine work that we did, just to highlight that. And a shout out to Crystal in Maine. Please give Crystal our best, who worked on that project with us as well. So I'm going to just close this out by saying thank you to everyone on the call who joined us for this. And hopefully we can begin to move forward in this country with a serious plan on how to address this gap, understanding exactly what it is, what it isn't, and hopefully begin to hold people more accountable for how we get to an end goal, which is all families having access to the kind and quality of care that their families need and deserve. So with that said, thank you again to Anubhav and to Ben and to everyone else who participated in this. Please go online and look at the survey, and go online and play with the map, especially if you're in one of the 25 states where your data is up there. So thank you to everyone, and have a great Halloween, and go out and vote. So thank you all.